In 2013, one tiny city made more gambling revenue than Las Vegas, Atlantic City, Singapore, and Monte Carlo combined. Not just more, 7 times more. $45 billion. From a former Portuguese colony the size of Manhattan, a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. A 12-square-mile speck off the coast of China where gambling was legal and everything else existed to serve it. The city was Macau, and for 40 years one man controlled almost everything. The casinos. The ferries that brought the gamblers from Hong Kong every hour. The helicopters that flew in the whales from Beijing and Shanghai. The horse racing track. The dog track. The hotels where the VIPs slept between sessions at the baccarat tables. Even the street that bore his name, the first street in Macau, named after a living Chinese person. His name is Stanley Ho. They called him the King of Gambling, the Godfather, the underground governor of a city that existed to separate Chinese millionaires from their money. When Hong Kong's wealthiest businessmen wanted to gamble, they went to Stanley's casinos. When mainland officials wanted to launder money, they went through Stanley's junkets. When American regulators tried to investigate, they found a web of shell companies and family trusts that led nowhere. At his peak, Stanley Ho's businesses employed 1/4 of Macau's entire workforce. His taxes funded 70% of the government's budget. His fortune reached $15 billion. His casinos generated more revenue in a single year than every casino in Nevada combined. But here's what makes his story worth telling. Stanley Ho never gambled, not once in his 98 years. He didn't play cards, didn't touch the slot machines, didn't even watch the games. When asked why, he said simply, "I don't have the patience." In interviews, he claimed his success was 95% hard work and only 5% luck. He believed in numbers, in probability, in the certainty that over time, the house always wins. He watched other people lose. That was the business model. Stanley Ho died in 2020, leaving behind 4 women he called his wives, 17 children spread across 4 families, and an inheritance war that makes Game of Thrones look subtle. Even now, years after his death, his family is still fighting over pieces of an empire that reshaped how 1 billion people gamble. But before any of that, before the billions and the wives and the casinos, before the triads and the Americans banning him from their country, Stanley Ho was a broke 20-year-old in a city under siege, and he was running out of options. He was born November 25, 1921, into one of Hong Kong's most prestigious families. The Ho Tungs were legendary. Stanley's great-uncle, Robert Ho Tung, was the richest man in Hong Kong. Mixed Chinese and European blood, properties everywhere. Political connections that spanned the British colonial government and Chinese business circles. Young Stanley grew up in mansions, servants, private schools, the expectation that wealth would simply continue. Then came the Great Depression. Stanley's father, Ho Sai Kwong, made catastrophic investments. Lost everything. Worse than lost. He was drowning in debt, humiliated, broken. Rather than face his creditors, he abandoned his family entirely, fled to Saigon, and never came back. What happened next scarred Stanley for life. 2 of his older brothers, unable to cope with the sudden poverty, the shame, the collapse of everything they'd known, committed suicide. The family went from mansion to tenement in months. Stanley's mother couldn't afford school fees. The prestigious Ho Tung name meant nothing without money behind it. Stanley had to earn scholarships just to stay in school. He studied constantly, not because he loved learning, but because education was his only way out. He became a champion, tennis champion, academic champion. He mastered English, Cantonese, Portuguese, later Japanese. A young man who understood what it meant to lose everything and was determined never to let it happen again. His brothers had killed themselves over money. Stanley decided he would never be in that position. Then Japan invaded. On Christmas Day, 1941, after fierce resistance that cost thousands of lives, Hong Kong fell to the Japanese Imperial Army. Stanley had been working as an air raid warden during the battle. When the Japanese marched in, executing anyone in uniform, he threw away his warden's outfit and ran for his life. He had one option: Macau, a tiny Portuguese colony 60 kilometers away that had declared neutrality. Portugal was neutral in World War II. The Japanese mostly left Macau alone. It became a refuge for everyone desperate to escape Japanese occupation. Thousands of refugees streamed across the border, many arriving with nothing. Stanley Ho arrived with $10 in his pocket and his mother's jewelry hidden in his clothes. But where most refugees saw desperation, Stanley Ho saw opportunity. Wartime Macau was chaos. Food shortages, rampant inflation, black markets everywhere, refugees dying in the streets. The Portuguese colonial government needed help keeping the city fed and functional. They created something called the Macau Cooperative Company. It was Macau's most important institution during the war, the organization that controlled food distribution, essential goods, everything the colony needed to survive. The ownership structure was remarkable. 1/3 owned by Portuguese families, 1/3 owned by local Chinese businessmen connected to the powerful Pedro Lobo, Macau's unofficial boss, and 1/3 owned by the Japanese army. Stanley Ho, 20 years old, somehow became its secretary. Think about what that means. He was essentially working for an organization partially controlled by Japan. The same Japan that had just conquered his home. The same Japan whose invasion had sent him fleeing. His job was to run the barter systems that kept Macau functioning, to negotiate with Japanese military officers. He later claimed to have given English lessons to Colonel Sawa, the head of Japanese military intelligence in Macau. After the war, critics called it collaboration. Stanley called it survival. The truth was probably more complicated. Macau's neutrality was always fragile, always dependent on Japanese tolerance. By 1943, Japan had effectively turned it into a protectorate, installing advisors to oversee the colony. Working with the Japanese wasn't a choice. It was the only way to exist. Here's what's undeniable. While people starved throughout Asia, while his own brothers had died from poverty, Stanley Ho thrived. He worked from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. He built connections. He opened a kerosene factory when fuel was desperately scarce. Then came an accident of war that made him rich. In early 1945, the Americans bombed Macau's gasoline terminal. They were worried Japan might use the city as a military base. The bombing destroyed Macau's main fuel supply. It also destroyed Stanley Ho's only competition. His kerosene monopoly became essential. Everyone who needed fuel had to come to him. Prices surged. Profits multiplied. By the time the war ended in August 1945, Stanley Ho was a millionaire. He was 24 years old. He'd arrived 4 years earlier with $10. He wrote in his memoirs, "Macau was paradise during the war." For him, it truly was. He moved fast after the Japanese surrender. Within weeks, he was back in Hong Kong making strategic investments. He bought a boat and started the first post-war ferry service between Hong Kong and Macau. Built construction companies, trading companies, and real estate. He ran goods during the Korean War embargo on China: rubber, iron, medicine, and vast quantities of Vaseline. Some say weapons, though Stanley always denied it. His partner in much of this was Henry F.O.K., another Hong Kong tycoon who would later become one of Hong Kong's richest men. They became experts at moving things that weren't supposed to move. In 1959, the Americans caught up with him. The U.S. Department of Commerce revoked his import licenses, saying he had violated the trade embargo on China. Stanley Ho was now persona non grata in the United States. He couldn't import American goods or do business with American companies. The door to the world's largest economy had slammed shut. He needed a new business, something that didn't require American approval, something uniquely Macanese. In 1961, the Portuguese colonial government announced it would issue a new casino license, not just any license, a monopoly. One company would control all gambling in Macau for the next 40 years. The incumbent was the Fu family, who'd run Macau's casinos for decades. They were expected to win. Stanley Ho had other plans. He assembled a consortium. He brought in Henry Fok, his smuggling partner. He brought in his brother-in-law, Teddy Yip, and critically, he brought in a man named Yip Han. Yip Han was a professional gambler, not a recreational player, a man who understood probability, game theory, how casinos actually made money. Stanley understood business, government connections, how to structure a deal. Yip Han understood gambling. Together, they bid $410,000 American dollars. They promised to promote tourism, to build infrastructure, to transform Macau from a backwater into a destination. They won by 17,000 Macanese patakas. On January 1, 1962, Stanley Ho's company, STDM, took control of every casino in Macau. The monopoly would last 40 years and 3 months. It would make Stanley Ho one of the richest men in Asia. It would transform Macau from a sleepy fishing village into the gambling capital of the world. At first, it wasn't much. Macau's casinos were run-down gambling dens, smoky rooms with fan-tan tables, local games that didn't attract international money. Nothing that would threaten Las Vegas or Monte Carlo. Stanley changed everything. In 1962, he opened the Estoril Hotel, Macau's first luxury casino resort. Western games, roulette, blackjack, baccarat, which would eventually become the most important game in Asian gambling. In 1970, he opened the flagship, Casino Lisboa. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every game you could imagine. Entertainment, restaurants, hotels, a complete destination. He didn't stop there. He bought the ferry company, then the jet foil service, cutting travel time from Hong Kong to under an hour, then the helicopter service for the VIPs who couldn't wait even that long. He bought the horse racing track, the dog track, hotels throughout Macau. He created a vertically integrated gambling empire where everything a visitor needed was controlled by Stanley Ho. Then, in the 1980s, he did something that would define Asian gambling for the next 50 years. He invented the VIP room. Here's the problem Stanley faced. Triad gangs were buying up ferry tickets and scalping them to tourists. They were muscling in on debt collection. They were inserting themselves into the gambling ecosystem whether he liked it or not. Fighting them was dangerous and probably futile. The triads had been operating in Hong Kong and Macau for generations. They weren't going away. So Stanley made them partners. He created private gambling rooms inside his casinos. Exclusive spaces where the stakes were higher and the scrutiny was lower. He leased these rooms to independent operators called junkets. These junket operators would bring high rollers from mainland China, where gambling was completely illegal, to Macau. They'd extend credit, collect debts, handle everything the casino legally couldn't do. The system was elegant and dark. Chinese law prevented anyone from taking more than about $3,000 out of the country. But mainland millionaires wanted to gamble with millions. Junkets solved this. They'd arrange credit in China. The gambler would play in Macau. Winnings or losses would be settled back on the mainland. Money that couldn't legally leave China flowed into Stanley's casinos. The junkets were almost all controlled by triads. The 14K, the Sun Yi On, the Kung Lok. Organized crime groups that had been operating in southern China for generations. They had the connections to find rich gamblers. They had the muscle to collect debts, which weren't legally enforceable in mainland China. They had the networks to move money across borders. Stanley Ho's system gave them a legal foothold in the casino industry. In exchange, they brought billions of dollars worth of Chinese gamblers through his doors. Did Stanley know who he was dealing with? Of course he did. Everyone did. The question wasn't whether triads operated in Macau's casinos. The question was whether that was an acceptable price for the money they brought in. Years later, when American gaming regulators investigated, a New Jersey report concluded that Stanley Ho had permitted organized crime to operate and thrive within his casinos. The report called him an associate of known and suspected triads. The Canadian government linked him to the Kung Lok triad. He was effectively banned from doing business in the United States, which is why his daughter Pansy had to sell her stake in MGM's Atlantic City operations. Stanley denied everything. Always. He said the allegations were misconceptions. He pointed out that he'd never been arrested, never convicted, never formally charged with anything. But the system he created, the VIP rooms, the junkets, the connection between organized crime and legal gambling continues to this day. In 2021, Chinese authorities finally cracked down, arresting major junket operators. But for 40 years, the system Stanley built moved hundreds of billions of dollars. While all this was happening, Stanley Ho was building something else, a family that defied conventional description. In 1942, during the war, he married Clementina Leitao. She came from a prestigious Portuguese family. The marriage gave him protection, social standing, access. They had 4 children. In 1973, she was in a car accident and suffered partial memory loss. She remained his official wife until her death in 2004. But by the late 1950s, Stanley had already taken a second wife, Lucina Liam. Polygamy was legal in Hong Kong until 1971, and Macau recognized such arrangements. Lucina gave him 5 children, including Pansy, Lawrence, and Daisy, who would become the most powerful of his heirs. Then came a third wife, Ina Chan. 3 more children. Then a fourth wife, Angela Leong, a woman nearly 40 years his junior. 5 more children. 4 wives, 17 children. All acknowledged, all expecting a share of an empire worth billions. And Stanley Ho controlled it all. Into his 80s and 90s, he never retired, never handed over the reins. The children jockeyed for position, the wives maneuvered for their families, but the patriarch held on. In 1999, Portugal returned Macau to China. In 2002, Beijing ended Stanley's monopoly, opening the market to foreign competitors. Las Vegas Sands, Wynn, MGM. They built glittering mega resorts on the Cotai Strip. Everyone expected Stanley Ho to be crushed. Instead, the opposite happened. Competition supercharged the market. China's economic boom created millions of new millionaires desperate to gamble. By 2013, Macau's gambling revenue hit $45 billion, 7 times Las Vegas, 8 times what it had been when the monopoly ended. Stanley Ho's company still operated 20 casinos. He was richer than ever. Then came the fall. In July 2009, Stanley Ho, now 87 years old, suffered a brain injury. Some reports said stroke. Some said he fell in his bathroom. He spent 7 months in the hospital. When he emerged, he was wheelchair-bound. His mind was impaired. He could no longer run the empire he'd built. What happened next shocked Hong Kong. In late 2010, documents emerged showing that 99.98% of the shares in Stanley's private holding company had been transferred. The recipients were companies controlled by his second and third wives and their children. The stake was worth approximately $1.5 billion. Stanley Ho, through his lawyers, claimed he had no idea what he'd signed, that he'd been pressured, that his post-surgical mental state left him unable to understand the documents. Then he appeared on television, flanked by his third wife and one of their daughters, looking frail. He said he'd fired his lawyer. The transfer was fine. Everything was resolved. Days later, his lawyer released videos of Stanley saying the opposite, that he'd been coerced into the television appearance, that he wanted his shares back. The family war went public. Newspapers tracked every twist. The stock price of his casino company dropped nearly 8% in a single day. The world watched one of Asia's wealthiest families tear itself apart in real time. By March 2011, they announced a settlement. The details were never fully disclosed, but the damage was done. The image of the all-powerful casino king, manipulated by his own family, unable to control his own fortune, was impossible to unsee. Stanley Ho lived another 9 years, mostly out of public view, wheelchair-bound, monitored by nurses. The various factions of his family settled into an uneasy truce, dividing responsibilities for different parts of the empire. On May 26, 2020, Stanley Ho died at Hong Kong Sanatorium Hospital. He was 98 years old. The family issued a joint statement. "Our 4 families stand united in our grief." They buried him with honors. The man who had built modern Macau, the king of gambling, who never gambled. But the war for his fortune wasn't over. In the months after his death, one of his daughters filed a caveat with Hong Kong's High Court, blocking any dealings with his estate without her approval. Various children reportedly unfollowed each other on social media. The $10.6 billion fortune continues to be divided and contested. Here's what Stanley Ho ultimately proved. A 40-year monopoly on gambling in the only place in China where it is legal creates unimaginable wealth. But that wealth comes with costs. Organized crime connections that follow you to the grave, a family structure so complex that inheritance becomes war, a legacy where your own children may seize control while you are recovering from surgery. Macau today generates $30 billion a year in gambling revenue. It still dwarfs Las Vegas. The casinos Stanley Ho built still operate. His children and wives control pieces of an empire that spans gaming, real estate, shipping, and entertainment. Pansy Ho is worth over $5 billion. Angela Leong, the 4th wife, over $4 billion. Lawrence Ho runs the City of Dreams. The family lost $4 billion in value between 2020 and 2022. They are no longer among Asia's 20 wealthiest dynasties, but they are still billionaires, several times over. And somewhere in those glittering casinos, in the VIP rooms that Stanley Ho invented, the junkets still operate. The connection between organized crime and legal gambling that he created still thrives. The system he built outlasted him. Stanley Ho never gambled because he understood something most gamblers don't. The house always wins. And for 40 years he was the house. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe for more untold casino dynasties. And tell me in the comments, what does it take to build an empire that big? And what does it cost to hold it together?